really interesting because I think it's a tool to actually gain control in workplaces. And this union that I talk about, IUE, was actually the pioneer in multiple tier workforce. Since the 80s, they bargained a multiple tier workforce, so we were not that surprised that they had a lean department. But they thought that they could actually have an impact on what management will do. But what we've seen is, no, they don't have any impact. Work is more flexible. There's speeding, and there's a renewal actually in managerial thinking about lean being the way of organizing things. So, and also it's spreaded. It used to be more on the assembly line, but what we discovered that now it's moving also in the other parts, because this is where you can get some economies of scale. So you have all those certification in plants, and especially when you're GM, Chrysler, Ford plant, so you're world-class manufacturing, bronze or silver or gold. So it's kind of a micro-corporatism, like I was saying. So really putting pressures on workers to be the best.
You said it. We heard the word flexibility. We need more flexibility in the workplace. Well, we're so flexible now, we can bend over and kiss our own ass goodbye.
Yeah, exactly. So, you're doing gymnastic between workplaces. Yeah, I mean, flexibility was also, what was really interesting in this research, that it was achieved also through bargaining because of reduced classification. But there's also contradiction in that, because there was a manager that we interviewed at Ford saying, yeah, the problem now is that we don't like job rotation. We want people to stay in the same place. So it's kind of contradiction between what we were hearing in the 90s and the auto sector sees, saying that job rotation was a good thing and people had to move between workplace, I don't know the word, but workplace inside the plant, and so you get it. It's getting more and more flexible, but I will say it's more gymnastic.
Where does, or is there any hope or future for the conservative model from continental Europe? Because, as you probably know, in continental countries, 80–90% of people work under a collective agreement. And it's not so much the strength of labor, because unions are relatively low in density, as much as the perception or understanding among the business class that it's in their interest to have stability. So here in the liberal state, it's conflict, clearly. Corporations, labor. It works out well in Scandinavia, where unions are really strong. And they have to go along or else they go out on strike. But is there any, and we would call it red Toryism perhaps, is there any future for educating the corporate powers that be in North America that it's in their interest to provide security? It's in their interest to provide movement up the ladder? Or is it so completely foreign to North American capitalism that don't even think about it?
I don't know about educating American capitalist class, but I do know in the context of Asia that there's all kinds of interesting research going on about global capitalism being, the kind of global capitalism being linked to where the colonizing power is coming from. So that a German multinational has, and the executives from a German multinational, has a whole different type of presence and attitude in India or wherever they are, or an Australian, again, usually they have a lot of experience with unions, or a British, and the American capitalism, which of course on the East Coast is what one was dealing with, was one of the most hostile to the development of worker rights. So if one was sort of thinking theoretically to start taking that apart, that there are progressive pieces. Now, I know from what I saw that the American executives were not open. And one of the things that happened on the East Coast was when they were first arriving and talking about setting up in Nova Scotia, one of the call centers, what they wanted to do is have extensions to something called the Michelin Bill, which was a bill which limited the ability of unions to organize. And I've never written this up, but I have been told that that was rejected. And so that, and they still moved in anyway. But in terms of seeing sort of cultural differences in management style, they come through loud and clear in the Asian context.
Yeah, you know, the example always used of a progressive non-union organization was Stronach at Auto Parts. And the idea was that he brought his European approach to labor relations. And I've also heard stories about when French companies come to the United States, they bring that ethos with them. So I guess, okay, fair enough, I'm 20 years in the past. But I guess the question is the conservative path, and it twigged me when you mentioned the Catholic Church, is the conservative path possible in Canada? I mean, you know what I mean by conservative, not...
Yeah, no, I mean the corporatist.
The corporatist, exactly.
But it's really a large question, but I will say first, I'm kind of critical right now of the European model, because a lot of research has shown that it's sorry, I don't have this word. It's just falling apart.
Okay.
Right now. You have this really good book of Baccaro and Howell about the neoliberal transformation of the models in Europe, where they show that if you look on the paper, yes, you got institution, but the plasticity of this institution make the fact that work as being more flexible, and on paper the system is still there, but they are as flexible as in France, in Italy, in Germany. Since the arts reform, you got a kind of like a second market that is really flexible and precarious.
And there was this article published about Germany moving to a neoliberal because of the labor changes.
And about bringing back some work practices in the US, there's also recent research about actually they are coming in the US to experiment some things that they can experiment in Europe, because in the US and Canada it's more flexible and more liberal. And I think if you, for example, Volkswagen Chattanooga, it's a good example. It's supposed to be the high end of social dialogue, Volkswagen, but they were as harsh as any American managers. So I will be kind of skeptical on that. So
good, fair enough.
Yeah.
Can I add? Yeah.
And then we'll have.
Sorry. No. I just this is you asked about Canada, but I think that it resonates with something that happened also in Latin America in the context of the pink tide. Well, it was the case of Argentina, but it was especially the case of Brazil. Brazil in the mid-2000s was one of the BRICS, and it seemed that and part of what the progressive Latin American governments were doing was saying, you know, this is much better for you. Capital should come to the region because this is so much better. And in fact, I mean, profits were going through the roof for transnational companies. However, I think that there is also a political reason why they moved away from progressive governments, and in the case of Brazil, were part of the conspiracy to impeach Dilma Rousseff and to end up with these fascists now. Because I think that even though unions are very good at disciplining workers, we are in a different moment in capital accumulation, and things are getting really a lot more difficult and more complicated, where really dominant classes in Latin America don't think that democracy is a good deal anymore, which is completely different from what they did in the 1990s during the transition to democracy. So we are seeing the beginning of a new stage where I don't think that any kind of representation and organization on the part of working classes will be part of dominant classes projects.
When you did your speech, you never talked about how precarious that industry is, because to me it's very precarious because people can just leave their jobs. We had it that happened in Oshawa, where people went in to go to work, the call center, and the doors are locked. They're going to move to Tennessee. Our union was progressive. We got a hold of them and they stopped it from coming in, but that doesn't stop them. They were going to the States, but it still doesn't stop any company that's got a call center to be able to move their jobs, because it's what's there to keep them there? They can just go bang like that, they're gone.
Yeah.
And there should be some protection for those workers, and I don't think the industry has protection for those workers by the government.
I think that was certainly our starting point, and certainly there are lots of examples where there have been companies that made announcements and just closed and were gone. There is still more call center open than closed. That having been said, depending on the type of call center, the part that's really vulnerable is if they're coming in and especially if they're just doing outsourced contracts. The deals that are made with the companies are often at most about 3 years long. So they will make a deal with AT&T or whoever to have a location for 3 years based on certain rates, whether the Canadian dollar is part of it, but the overall contract. And everyone, and it's not just happening in Canada, but all over the world, whether it's the Philippines or India or all the other places where AT&T is negotiating contracts, everybody knows that at the end of that contract, there will be a reassessment of whether that is a viable call center, and if it isn't, they're gone. So that piece of the industry, the outsourced, especially in telecommunications, is one of the most vulnerable pieces. And so where I saw the openings and closings, that was the fastest moving, most vulnerable section. And the people who are, and then the somewhat more protected was people who are part of one employer where there's been a vertical integration and the call center is vertically integrated into the overall structure. So you are not just, you're not working for another, so you are actually part of a corporation and could move out of the call center into other jobs in that sector. And that there's some kind of depth to that, whatever that's for the big company sectors. And then there's a little bit of stability in some of the really small ones, you know, the ones that are doing local home heating or that are working for local companies. Sometimes the overall packages aren't quite as good, but in terms of the actually stability of employment, it's a bit better. So it's variable, that's what I discovered. But it's not to minimize, because even in terms of the investments that are in that, you know, most of the investment, as I said, is the wage package. So there's not a huge sort of investment in the building or anything else.